Hi, good afternoon, and welcome back to our weekly Parsha, PaRDeS class, in which we study the Torah portion through the lens of PaRDeS, which means orchard, and is also an acronym for Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Soid, the simple meaning, the hints, the derived meaning, and the secrets of Torah that exist within every part of Torah. Okay, so this week, we study the Torah portion of Eschanon, and some of the essentials of Judaism can be found in Eschanon, notably the Aseret HaDibros, the Ten Commandments are in Eschanon. And after the Aseret HaDibros, the Ten Commandments, which are repeated in Eschanon with some slight changes from how they were mentioned in Yisro, in the book of Exodus, then the Torah records the Shema Yisrael. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, go through the commentary and some of the deeper ideas behind the Shema. The Shema is recited every single day. It should be recited at least twice a day, once in the morning and once at night. That's because the Torah says, "V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela," these words shall be upon your heart, b'shachbecha u'bekumecha, when you lay down and when you arise. And there's a debate in the Talmud as to what that means. So the Beis Shammai, the opinion of Beis Shammai, is that it means literally, as you lay down, you should say the Shema, and as you rise, as you stand up, you should say the Shema. Beis Hillel is of the opinion, and this is the opinion that we follow, is that it's not about the position of the body, but rather the time of day. So the time of day in which you lay down, which is nighttime, you should say the Shema, and the time of day in which you arise, bikumecha, you should also say the Shema. And that's the halacha that we follow. So an interesting point about the Shema is that if we go through the prayer book, and we go through the prayers that we do every day or every week, there is only one prayer that has been recited continuously since we received the Torah, since for the last 3,300 years, and that is the Shema. Every other part of the prayer was developed later. The concept of prayer is mentioned in the Torah, comes from the Torah, but the words of prayer were almost entirely established by the sages, or that different parts of the prayer come from the Torah, but the fact that they are included in the everyday prayer is something that the sages determined later. The one prayer which has been said continually every single day for over 3,000 years is the Shema. And it's profound when you recite the Shema. I think that this has been recited every single day by the Jewish people, by my ancestors, 3,300 years ago until today. These words have been recited. And so therefore the Shema is really an exceptional prayer. We get to say it every day, and hopefully by saying it every day, we don't lose the appreciation to the value of the words of the Shema. So let's talk about what the Shema is, and then we'll try to appreciate it a little bit more for all the times we will continue to say it. So the Shema is in this week's Parsha book of Eschanon, chapter 6. It's also the 6th Aliyah, Pasuk Daled, Pasuk number 4. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. What does Rashi have to say about that? Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Firstly, even the simple meaning of it is kind of demands explanation. What exactly are we proclaiming when we say that? If we're proclaiming that we believe in God, so then just say, I believe in God, believing that there's one God. So say those words, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Echad, there's one God. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad begs explanation as to what we are saying. And there's many explanations, and they're not mutually exclusive. We can appreciate these words from numerous angles. So let's start with Rashi. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. What is the meaning of the words Hashem is out, which is our God, Hashem Echad is one God? Says Rashi, Hashem Shehu Elokeinu Ata. Hashem, which is our God now, the Lord, which is our God now, V'lo Elokei Umas. And the nations of the world have not accepted God yet, as we understand God to be. Who asidli yos Hashem Echad, will eventually become the God, one God for all of humanity. As the pasuk says in Sefania, Ki az epoch el amim, Safa berura likra v'kulam Shem Hashem. I will convert the people to a pure language that all of them call out in the name of Hashem. Also the pasuk, this is a more famous one, as we say in the davening every day, by Yomahu Yihi Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad. On that day, God will be one and His name will be one. So the simple meaning of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, because again, the question is, if we are simply declaring that there's one God, so then we should just say Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad. Why Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad? Rashi says we are saying that, Hear, O Israel, the Lord that is our God now will eventually become the one God for all of the world. It's important to point out that Rashi is not saying that at some point all of the nations of the world will convert to Judaism. That's clear. That's not what Rashi is saying, nor is that a goal. But rather, all the nations of the world will convert, if you may, to monotheism, to understand that there is one God. And that's what Avram, the first Jew, set out to do, and that is the goal which will be accomplished. The idea of the belief that all the nations of the world will have with one God. And this is why, I mentioned in the context of conversion, because often when someone looks to convert to Judaism, as is commonly known, initially they are discouraged. We don't encourage conversion, and part of the process of part of the words which are typically said in discouragement is that you don't need to become a Jew to be connected to God. The main thing is that you embrace the oneness of Hashem. You embrace the oneness of God, and you've accepted the fundamental principle of Judaism as well. You don't have to be a Jew to do that. So this is the idea of Hashem Echad, that the goal that eventually all of the nations of the world will recognize the oneness of Hashem. Let's continue a few more lines, and then I think we'll come back to this verse and spend the rest of the time understanding the verse of the Shema. So the pasuk continues: "V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'chol nafshecha b'chol me'odecha." You shall love God, the Lord, your God, with all your heart and all your soul and all your means. And again, this pasuk too demands explanation. What exactly are the three levels of love that are being described over here? What are the three levels of love that are being described? Levavcha, nafshecha b'chol me'odecha. Love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your means. When it comes to loving a fellow Jew, which is also an essential mitzvah of the Torah, the words are ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your fellow as yourself. Why is it when it comes to the love of Hashem, it's an entirely different statement? It's love God. Why not love God as you kamocha, like you love yourself? And vice versa. Why, when it comes to our fellow, don't we say love your fellow b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol me'odecha? So what is the significance of these three descriptions and obligations of love? They're not just descriptions, they're obligations. You should love God. You must love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Or over here, translate with all your means. So again, let's go to Rashi. Rashi tells us, first Rashi, Asei dvarav me'ahava. Perform His commandments out of love. As Rashi continues, you cannot compare one who serves God out of love to one who serves God out of fear. When a person serves their master out of fear, then when it becomes too much, the servant leaves. The commentaries point out over here that these words, this is very important to appreciate the context over here, and that is that two verses before the Shema, in chapter 6, verse number 2, the pasuk says, "L'ma'an tiras Hashem Elokecha." You should fear the Lord your God. Lishmar kol chukosav v'mitzvosav. To fear God with all of your and observe all the statutes, all His mitzvahs which God commands you. But not only the verse which states clearly the obligation of fearing Hashem, really the whole build-up towards this was all about fear of Hashem. In other words, a few verses earlier, 10, 15 verses earlier, we had the Ten Commandments. And if you read through the Torah portion after the Ten Commandments, God emphasizes the idea of the awe of that moment. You all saw the glory of Hashem. You faced God, you heard God face to face. So the whole build up to the Shema is strengthening and emphasizing Yiras Shamayim, fear of God. And so therefore it strengthens the point that the Torah, as Rashi clarifies, is making over here, is that even though God says, even though I've just pushed and emphasized the importance of Yiras Shamayim, fear of heaven, nonetheless, you have the obligation of loving Hashem. And obviously one has to be able to juggle both of those feelings. But it is not enough to serve Hashem out of fear. A person must have a service of Hashem that comes from a place of love. It's interesting, the order, that we start with Yiras Shamayim and then move on to Avas Hashem. If you look in Chassidus, it talks about, and this is a broad concept, but very briefly, it talks about that there is a lower love of Hashem and a higher love of Hashem, or a more profound love of Hashem. It's called Ahava Tata and Ava Ilah. And so too, when it comes to fear of Hashem, there is Yira Tata, a lower level of fear, and there is Yira Ilah, a loftier level of fear of Hashem. And the order, when one wants to connect to Hashem, wants to start from the ground up, the order of one's connection to Hashem is you start with the lower level of Yira. It begins with the basic Yiras Shamayim, fear of God. That's the opening, that's the entrance to connect to Hashem. From there, you move on to the lower level of Ahavas Hashem. So the order of the Torah, as it says it over here, first Yiras Hashem, and then moves on to Ahavas Hashem. After that, you move on to the higher level of Ahavas Hashem. So it goes Yiras Hashem, lower Yiras Hashem, followed by lower Ahavas Hashem, followed by the Ava Ilah, the greater level of love of Hashem. And perhaps it could even be said that these two levels of Ahava are themselves alluded to in the statement over here of Ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all me'odecha, and all your being. It very well could be that b'chol me'odecha itself is the higher level of love of Hashem. And then one can graduate to the highest of the four levels, which is Yira Ilah, which is the lofty level, the higher level of Yira, which is the level of really self, of bittul b'mtzias, a level of self-nullification entirely in one's sense of awe in the presence of Hashem. But let's get back to the text over here. You should love God with all your heart, and all your soul, and all your being. What are those three levels? So again, Rashi starts by saying it's important to serve God out of love. A person should have a loving relationship with Hashem. But then what are the three levels? So with all your heart, Rashi says, is b'shnei yitzarecha, with both of your inclinations, with both your good inclination and your evil inclination. That's why it says levavcha, not libcha. Levavcha indicates two hearts. With all your heart, suggests two hearts. A person only has one heart, but a heart over here means passion. And therefore a person has within them naturally has spiritual passion, but also material passion. And that's called the Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Hara. We have the passion which pushes us for selfish purposes and for animalistic purposes. That fits into the category of the Yetzer Hara. And the Torah says, don't just love Hashem with your godly soul. Learn to love God with your animal soul too. Learn that even your animal can be driven in your relationship with Hashem and become to love Hashem. This reminds me of an idea which the Rabbi talks about, the Medrash talks about when it comes to the months of Nisan and Iyar. When we have the first, really Nisan is the first month of the year. If you look in the Torah, even though Tishrei is the beginning of the year, but Nisan is the first month of the year. Nisan, we went out of Egypt. And then and therefore we celebrate that with Pesach. The significance of Iyar we know is when we count the Omer, which our sages explain, counting the Omer was a process of rectification of one's character. So we have the counting of the Omer, 7 times 7, each day and each night we are fixing one element of our character. And that's not our godly soul, our animal soul is being fixed, is being elevated. And therefore there's a pasuk in Shir Hashirim. There's a pasuk which says, in the book of Song of Songs, which is a book which describes the love between God and the Jewish people and the Jewish people and Hashem. And the pasuk says, One of the psukim says, Mashcheni, which means you have drawn me closer. Acharecha narutza, after you, I have run. But the truth is, after you, we run. Narutza is we run. And the question when reading that verse is, why the word mashcheni, you have drawn me, is singular. You have drawn me. And acharecha narutza is that we run after you. Following mashcheni, it should say, after you, I run. You drawn me. And so I said, God, first you drew me closer, and then I ran after you. So why is it singular followed by plural? And the explanation given, Rabbi talks about this as well, is that when God took us out of Egypt, our animal soul was not in any way refined. God pulled us out because of our neshama. Mashcheni, God pulled me out. Me, individual, means just the divine soul was really pulled out. Again, the bodies left too, but the connection to Hashem when we left Egypt was very much just our neshama. Our bodies were really very much embedded in the Egyptian lifestyle. And that's why it's Mashcheni, singular. Acharecha narutza, after you, we will run, is a reference to the month of Iyar, in which we work on our nefesh hamas, we work on our animal soul, we work on the animal within us, so that when it comes to, by the time Iyar is over, we say, we are running after you. We is not many of many people. It's within myself. It's the we. The godly soul and the animal soul are both pursuing Hashem's Torah. And that's the idea of b'chol levavcha, Rashi is saying, is that both of your hearts, a person has to work to cause that even their animal soul is excited to serve Hashem. And it's not all or nothing. Someone may say, what do you mean? I'm not there. You may not be there in all areas, but there's certainly some mitzvahs which I think we can say our animal soul is excited to observe. Right? If we spoke about this in Pirkei Avos a few weeks ago, asay ritzonah k'tzoncha, make God's will your will, which means, what does asay ritzonah as opposed to the next statement, which is batal ritzonah, nullify your will. Asay ritzonah k'tzoncha, make God's will your will, is a way of saying, make it not just your divine will, make that your animal soul, your entire being, wants to serve Hashem. And again, it may be only in certain mitzvahs. And then you work on yourself and try to build that feeling so that both your animal and godly soul are serving Hashem. Okay, what's the next? So that's b'chol levav. B'chol nafshecha. Here we have b'chol nafshecha afilu hu noitel es nafshecha. B'chol nafshecha, with all your soul. What could be greater than you're serving God with all your heart? What's greater than that is that one is able to serve God, even if He takes your soul. Which means that the love we have for Hashem and our commitment to Hashem should be such that I am ready to give up my life to serve Hashem. Ready to give up my life to serve Hashem. And our sages tell us that a person should think about this every day. When a person gets to these words in the Shema, a person should meditate for a moment on the fact that they are willing to give up their life for Hashem. Thank God we live in a time where most people at least don't have to actually face this decision. But a person can nonetheless make the commitment, even if they don't have to actually give their life up. And that's what a person is supposed to have in mind at this moment. B'chol nafshecha, beyond just loving God with all my being, is that I'm ready to give up everything for the sake of Hashem. I'm ready to give up my life for the sake of Hashem. Sages tell us about someone, perhaps a very famous person, who did give up his life to save for Hashem. And that's Rabbi Akiva. We actually read about it in the Tisha B'Av Kinos, and the elegies of Tisha B'Av talks about the 10 martyrs, one of whom was Rabbi Akiva. And it says that when he was dying, he was also smiling. And his students were shocked. They couldn't understand how he could be smiling while he was brutally murdered in a very painful way. So they asked, how can you be smiling? And he answered as follows. He said, every day for the last however many years, I think the accurate amount would be 80 years. For the last 80 years, every single day, I've been praying and saying the words of the Shema. And every day I say, B'chol nafshecha. I say that I'm ready to give up my life for you, to Hashem. But I can never know if it's for real or not. I can never know if, as I'm praying every day, if I mean it. Because until a person faces it, they can never know 100%. He says, now that I'm actually giving my life up for Hashem, and he did so voluntarily. In other words, he studied Torah and taught Torah despite knowing that he could be killed for it. He says, now it validates, I don't know if the word is validates or clarifies the prayers that I've done for the last 80 years. That now I know that I meant it, now that I'm actually able to give up my life. So Rabbi Akiva was able to celebrate the fact that he knew for certain that those words, that he meant it. And so therefore, this is the talk about the thought process one could have when saying the Shema. This is a moment to think about the idea of Mesiras Nefesh. On a lighter, I don't know if the word is lighter, but Chassidus also explains that Nefesh, which means soul, is also one's ratzon, one's desires. So B'chol nafshecha, just when Mesiras Nefesh, which could mean the sacrificing of my soul, which means giving up one's life, or Mesiras Nefesh, if we understand the Nefesh, which is one's soul, is one's desire. The desire is at the core of one's soul. At the core of my being is that which I want to do. Sometimes I could understand it, sometimes I can't understand it. Sometimes I could justify it, sometimes I can't. But my ratzon, my desires place is at the very core of my identity. So when a person sacrifices their desires or their will for the sake of Hashem, that is a form of Mesiras Nefesh. That is a form of self-sacrifice. So if I'd like to not just meditate upon this idea, but actually put it into action without having to give up my life, one way of doing so is by challenging oneself to be every day, to do Mesiras Haratzon, sacrifice my desire for Hashem. Again, this brings us back to that mission in Pirkei Avos. It says, "Aseh Ritzayin Chak Yirtzayin." Make God's will your will. That's B'chol Levavcha. Make God's will your will. But ultimately, there's going to be points in time where God's will is not going to be your natural will. So then the next words of Pirkei Avos is Batil Ritzayin Chavnei Ritzayin. But nullify your will in a situation where you cannot turn your will into God's will. Okay, so then learn to nullify your will. And that's a higher level. And that's what we're going, that's the same idea over here. B'chol Levavcha means turn all your desires into Hashem's desires. The animal soul, the godly soul, all serving Hashem, loving Hashem. But then, in a circumstance where that doesn't happen, okay, b'chol nafshecha. So then have Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice, which again could mean, and aside from the simple meaning, giving up one's life, it means giving up one's desires for the sake of Hashem. And finally, b'chol me'odecha, and this is perhaps the most unique of all. What could be better than giving up your life? It's almost talking about love God with and moving up levels. So what could be greater than giving up one's life? So the simple answer is almost humorous, but there's great depth to it. And I say it's almost not humorous, it's for real, but it almost comes across as somewhat funny, which is B'chol me'odecha, says Rashi, B'chol mamoncha, all your money. Don't just love God with your life, ready to give up your life, but rather also and above that, love God with all your wealth, with all your possessions. As Rashi goes on to say, Yesh lacha adam shemamoinoi chavev alav migufa. There are people whose possessions are more precious to them than their own bodies. So a person you tell someone, "Be ready to give up your body for Hashem," you say, "No problem." To give up your wealth for Hashem, that's very difficult for some people. And therefore the Torah says, learn to love Hashem with all your wealth. How do you love God with your wealth? It means by giving charity first and foremost. And then it means by spending properly on the mitzvahs that you do. And this is B'chol me'odecha. But perhaps one could also point out that until now, B'chol Levavcha B'chol Nafshecha could very easily remain abstract. I love God with my godly soul, my animal soul. Yes, it's a love that I really feel and genuine. But all right, nobody other than I knows whether it's true or not. B'chol Nafshecha, I'm ready to give up my life. Again, it could be genuine and serious, but it's somewhat removed from reality, unless, like Rabbi Akiva, one has to do so. B'chol me'odecha is very practical. B'chol me'odecha is circumstances we face every single day. And so therefore, one can, in an idealistic world, be at very lofty levels. But practically speaking, are you spending your wealth to serve Hashem? Are you able to share from your wealth out of your love for Hashem? And that's B'chol me'odecha. B'chol me'odecha is the $5 you have in your pocket. There's a famous and very profound joke that is said about two Russian peasants in the time of the Tsar. And everyone knew you loved the Tsar was everything. And they're having a conversation. One turns to the other and says, would you give up, if you had a palace, would you give it up for the Tsar? And he says, certainly. He says, if you had this a sturdy wagon with 4 strong horses, would you give that up would you give that to the Tsar? He says, yes. And then he turns to him and says, if you had 2 chickens, would you give that to the Tsar? He says, no, that I wouldn't do. He says, why not? He says, because 2 chickens I have. That I can't get to the Tsar. So often we speak about lofty ideas of our commitment and our love for Hashem, but what about the 2 chickens? And that's b'chol me'odecha. The one way of understanding is b'chol me'odecha is also on a very practical level, all your means. That's one idea of b'chol me'odecha. The second idea of b'chol me'odecha, Rashi says, davar acher. Another understanding of b'chol me'odecha is b'chol mida umida shemoded la. Whatever measure Hashem meets out to you, whether midah tova or whether midah paranias, whether it's the good times or the painful times. As David says, as the pasuk in Tehillim says, Kois Yeshuas esa tzara v'yogan emtza, which is, I lift up my the same Psalm 116 talks about I lift up my cup for Hashem's salvations, and I also called out to Hashem in times of trouble and grief. In other words, that a person's love for Hashem to carry through the good times and the bad times. We all know how difficult this idea is. Perhaps the most difficult when it comes to faith in Hashem is the ability to have faith in Hashem in painful times. We talk about it, it's spoken about often, but for a person to actually live that quality, and we're all blessed to know such people who go through difficult times, painful times, and nonetheless their love for Hashem doesn't waver. And this is b'chol me'odecha. In a way, I think when what comes to mind when I read these words are those who went through the Holocaust, survived. So there are those who were killed in the Holocaust. They died al kiddush Hashem. They died sanctifying God's name. They fulfilled b'chol nafshecha, without a doubt. But then there's those people who survived, and in some ways they had to live for the next however many years with the Holocaust as fresh on their minds. So they live 40, 50, 60 years beyond that. And those who chose nonetheless, like my grandparents, my mother's parents who survived, chose nonetheless to live a life of commitment, a love of commitment to Hashem, commitment to Torah, and a love and a cherishing of Torah mitzvahs. That's b'chol me'odecha. Because they saw the pain, they saw the most difficult times, and then they had to make a choice afterwards. They all made choices. They weren't just following in the path that they'd been raised. After when the war ended, they were all at ground zero. They all then had to make a choice of what life to live. And they made that choice to follow in a path of Torah and connection, commitment to Hashem. That's b'chol me'odecha. B'chol mido mida, having seen the highs and the lows, and nonetheless remaining with a love for Hashem, that's b'chol me'odecha. Anyway, we'll stop here, but these are some of the ideas, just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to appreciation of the Shema. We got through 2 of the verses, and on these 2 verses alone, there's so much more to talk about. But be that as it may, hopefully this will inspire that the Shema that we say daily will go to a deeper level of prayer, a deeper level of commitment. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi.